I'm Evan Childress. I'm the Chief of Natural and Cultural Resources at Shenandoah National Park. I'm standing here at Meadow Run, which is in the southern part of the park. And this is a stream that has been heavily impacted by acid deposition, commonly called acid rain. Essentially, burning of fossil fuels releases acid into the atmosphere, travels through the air, and is deposited across the landscape. And Shenandoah is a hotspot for deposition, partly because of its higher elevation than the surrounding areas. That acid deposition causes problems for lots of kinds of ecosystems. So streams are one of those. And this stream has had the lowest pH, so it's been the most acidic of any of our streams within the park. One of the reasons for that is that it has a type of bedrock under the landscape here. It's called siliciclastic, which reminds you of silica, basically sand, stone, glass, essentially. So this is a very non-reactive kind of bedrock. It doesn't have very much buffering capacity in it. It doesn't have the kinds of elements in it that can offset the acid impacts. The acid is stored really well in the soils and it kind of leaches out over time. Acidic water makes it basically hard for aquatic animals to breathe. It affects the way that the oxygen moves across their gills, and so it creates challenges for them. And so some species are better able to tolerate than others. Many of the macroinvertebrate species are not able to live under the acidic conditions. So I'm actually having trouble finding bugs to show off in this moment. There certainly are in here, and typically they'll be living under the rocks, and that's what feeds the fish as well. Stonefly. Aquatic insects typically will have an aquatic nymph stage, and then they emerge and fly around as adults to mate. In 1990, I believe, the amendments to the Clean Air Act were passed. They were specifically targeted to try to reduce the amount of acid that the sources like power plants were emitting, and they were largely successful. So, over the course of that next decade, the emissions of acid reduced substantially. And that still didn't solve the problem here, though, because the acid is stored in the soils and it kind of comes out slowly over time. The park actually got some funding through a court settlement, a Clean Air Act suit, in which some companies had to pay fines for violating the Clean Air Act, and the park was able to get some of that money to do a big restoration project here. So the plan is to distribute limestone sand across much of the watershed, and limestone it basically counteracts the acid, so it neutralizes the acid, and the hope is that it will bring up the pH in the soils in the surrounding forest, it will bring up the pH in the stream, and it will help this place recover from the impacts of acid deposition. So the project that the trust has funded here is to try to understand whether that restoration project is working and how. Our partners at University of Virginia came out and they did a survey across the watershed. So they started down here, we're near the bottom, and they went up into all the little tributaries and looked at the water chemistry across that entire stream network. So that will give us a baseline before we do this restoration project, and then afterwards we'll come back and have another look. So the headwaters are sometimes especially acidic because they just drain a small area. If that area doesn't have any buffering capacity, then it can be kind of the worst of the worst. Understanding how it's distributed across the network is really important, and we can understand how that restoration project has affected those different pieces of the stream network. And it's likely that we won't be able to lime the entire watershed just based on limited funding, and so we'll have also some areas that were untreated and some that were treated, and be able to compare those. And this is the first time that a project like this has happened within the National Park Service. So it's really important that we take the time to understand how it's working and understand if we would do it differently the next time around. We have a lot of watersheds in the park and across the region that are similarly impacted by acid deposition. And so the more we can learn about how this is going, the more we can use that experience to build better projects in the future and continue to restore the landscape. Some of the impacts of acid rain are on brook trout and the other fish species that call this stream home, or historically did. For a while, all the other species except for brook trout were eliminated from this stream. Brook trout are fairly hardy, so they have continued to persist, but their numbers are lower and they tend to be smaller and skinnier than in places that don't have this acid rain problem. Over the last 2 decades or so, we have seen some recovery in the brook trout populations, even without a restoration project. But the density of brook trout is still on the low end of what we would expect for a stream of this size if you look at the park as a whole. And so there's some very slow recovery happening, which is really encouraging. But by doing this restoration project, we're hoping that we can really speed that up and bring the population back to what we would expect for a stream of this size. Good flow stability and pretty cold water. So this could be really good habitat if we're able to bring the pH back under control.